Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations at Noon at Connecticut's Old State House. My name is Mariana Garcia. I'm a museum educator at the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's program, People Preserving Connecticut's Past. Meet the new state librarian and state archaeologist. During the program, I encourage you all to please send us your questions and your comments in the comments section of this video, and we'll keep an eye on those. And if you also have a minute at the end of the program, I encourage you as well to take a quick look at our survey, which you'll find a link to that at the very bottom of the video description. And we would love to hear your feedback. So, who saves a state's past? What is being done to make history accessible to everyone? Connecticut has recently welcomed two new key figures whose work helps to preserve our state's history. Today, we are very happy to be joined by State Librarian Deborah Schander and State Archaeologist Sarah Sportman, who are here to talk to us about their new roles and the exciting projects and challenges they are working on to preserve Connecticut's past. Sarah Sportman became Connecticut State Archaeologist in 2020. She holds a bachelor's in history from Union College and a master's in history and historical archaeology from the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Connecticut. Sarah has worked as an archaeologist for 20 years, researching, teaching, and speaking about the archaeology and history of Euro-American and pre-colonial indigenous groups in New England and New York. Before accepting the position of state archaeologist, she worked as a cultural resource management archaeologist for CRM firms in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York, focused on archaeological projects related to construction and development. Deborah Schander began her tenure as state librarian in 2021. Prior to joining the Connecticut State Library, she was an educator and law librarian, serving in library administrations at Seton Hall University and Vanderbilt University, as well as working at law libraries in Georgia and California. She holds a GD and an MLIS from Florida State University. She writes and speaks on a variety of topics, including legal research, instruction, leadership development, personal management, technology, library outreach. Deborah is a past chair of the Professional Engagement, Growth and Advancement Special Interest section of the American Association of Law Libraries, as well as a past president of the Atlanta Law Libraries Association. Thank you both so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so before we get into all the exciting projects you're doing right now in your new roles, why don't we have a little bit of backstory? So how did you both first get interested in your respective fields?
Sarah, you want to go?
I'll go, sure. So I know it sounds a little bit trite, but when I was little, my grandparents lived up in the Adirondacks in New York, not far from Lake Champlain. And in the summers when we visited, my dad always took us to Fort Crown Point or Fort St. Frederick, which was a fort that was used in the French and Indian and Revolutionary Wars. And they had ruins that you could walk around in and a little museum you could walk through. And I was just so fascinated by the idea that you could find people's things to learn about their lives in the past. And then later in college as a history major, I was really frustrated by the types of things that you couldn't learn from the documentary record. And when I realized that archaeology could really be a powerful tool when paired with the historical record for filling in the gaps to learn about regular people and women and children and people that just didn't make it into the documentary record. So I was kind of hooked.
Thank you very much.
Good idea. So I actually came to it not expecting to become a librarian at all. When I was younger, I wanted to be a baker. I wanted to be a marine biologist. I wanted to do all of these other things. I love to read, but becoming a librarian never was something that I thought about. In college, I was studying to be a journalist and wound up deciding to change my mind on going down that route. But I wound up taking a communications law class as part of my course of study. And I thought, I love this. This is so fascinating. All of these issues are interesting. The way that they impact people's lives is something that I would like to continue studying. And so I made the decision to go to law school. But at the time, I was a fairly introverted person. I didn't like the idea about being up in front with people. And so I went into law school knowing that traditional practice and litigation wasn't something that I was interested in. But I was willing to see what the options were. And fortunately, we had a library director who had just joined us. She had been a member of the JAG team before she came, and then had become a law librarian, and said, hey, did you know that we offer a law library program at this university? You should look into it. And so it was a really wonderful way to blend together my academic interests, what I wanted to study and spend my time doing, with the ability to become a librarian and do the work there and learn to be upfront. And I wound up becoming a teacher for many years. And so it became this really rich, rewarding opportunity to not only keep in the academic side of things, but to contribute to the profession in a way that not everybody is able to do. So that was my path to it.
Thank you both so much. It's always interesting how people end up where they end up. Sometimes it's serendipity, and sometimes it's something you plan your whole life. And speaking of planning, how did you both become interested in your respective positions of state librarian and state archaeologist?
You want to go?
So I, as I said, I have been an academic law librarian. I thought that was going to be what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. But it's a very specialized profession. You work with a very small group of people, law students, law faculty, as well as members of the public. People are representing themselves in court. It was very rich and rewarding work. I enjoyed that. It was meaningful in a variety of ways. But I think as many people discovered, the pandemic made us think about things a little bit more. And I was thinking about the fact that my family was close, but not close enough. I was thinking about the fact that I had this background in the humanities and in education and in reading that I really wasn't able to use to its full potential in law libraries in a way that I thought would be interesting. And so what attracted me about this position was it gave me a chance to be closer to family, but the state library does so many different things. We're not just a law library. We're responsible for archives and public records, working with public libraries. We're a law library as well. We have the Museum of Connecticut History. And so it was an opportunity to take what I was doing, the work that I enjoyed doing, but work with other groups of people to expand upon that and to provide leadership in that area. And so it was just an amazing opportunity to expand what I was doing. And I think that was really what attracted me. And the Connecticut State Library is really a leader among our colleagues, I think, in terms of because we do so much more. Not every state library does all of the things that we do. And so it was just an incredible opportunity.
So I got interested in the position a long time ago. Back when I was in grad school at UConn, I had the opportunity to be a teaching assistant for Nick Bellantoni, who was a state archaeologist for many, many years. And I TA'd for his class, and, he was the most engaging professor I'd ever seen. And part of that is just that he's a very warm and gregarious person. But another part of it was that he had all of these fantastic stories to tell. And I realized that, in his role as state archaeologist, he'd had the opportunity to study all of Connecticut history, 12,000 plus years of stories of, human occupation, ranging from the Paleo-Indian period through the industrial period and into the 20th century. And I thought, what a cool job that is, because, before taking this position, I'd worked in academic archaeology and I worked in cultural resource management archaeology. So I got to learn about a lot of different things and study them and research them, but we mostly shared what we learned with other archaeologists. And, the state archaeologist gets to bring all those amazing stories that we uncover to the public. So we get to talk, bring this information to people who are interested in history, to school children, to descendant communities, to everyone. And it just seemed like such an amazing opportunity to share the really exciting things that we learn every day with people who are genuinely interested. And, I really think, too, that it's an opportunity to engage people in those stories and that past and to raise awareness of preservation. So all of those things kind of really drew me to the job.
Thank you very much. And once you knew what you wanted, how did you come to become the respective state librarian and state archaeologist?
Well, I can just say, after having working in academic and cultural resource management archaeology, I spent a good part of my career in Connecticut. I went to grad school at UConn, and then I stayed local. I mostly worked in southern New England. So I got really familiar with the archaeological record of the area. I also became really involved in the archaeological community, the Archaeological Society of Connecticut, and other, regional and local groups. And so when the position came up, I just applied for it, and I guess I was the best fit. So it worked out.
And I would say kind of the same thing. I trained, as I said, kind of focusing on the law side of things rather than a specific part of the country. As Mariana said at the beginning, I have moved around a lot. And one of the things about being a librarian, and particularly a law librarian, is in many cases you go where the jobs are, particularly in academia. And so I sort of became an expert at learning new state laws and learning different jurisdictions in order to do my job. But you get tired of moving, you get tired of doing some of those things, and you look for that job that is something that you can do, that is exciting and gets you ready to come into the office and do what you're doing every day. And this was an opportunity. And so it was a very straightforward application process. Somebody had reached out to me and said, hey, did you know that this position is open? I know you're looking at maybe potentially expanding beyond what you've been doing. Went through the process, had a really wonderful conversation with the board and the search committee, and finished out my semester and was able to move up here. So that's how I got here.
Right. Thank you both so much. And what is exactly a state librarian and a state archaeologist? What does the job entail?
I've started saying, like, every day is an adventure. You never quite know what my day is going to be like. And I think part of that is, as I said before, there is so much to this job. People tend to think of libraries as one specific thing. They think of their public library. They think of maybe an academic library where they studied in college. But there are all kinds of different libraries. There's music libraries, there's special collections, there's museums, law, all kinds of things. And so the state library, like I said, tends to cover so many of those different things that my job is kind of bringing together the library community as a whole. I spend time with the academic librarians in the state, public librarians, with the law library community. I'm still able to be part of that as well. And so sometimes my job is just representing what we do, sharing information about recent events that are happening. Sometimes it is going to historical societies or ribbon cutting events or anything that's happening that's interesting and exciting. We also give out a variety of grants that we oversee. We're going to be starting a new kind of reading program that we're looking into. And so every day is a little bit different, but it is, like I said, I think I would encompass it as representing the library community, raising awareness of the library community to the state of Connecticut, and then also nationally too.
Yeah, I would say on a similar note, State Archaeologist of Connecticut is a job that it wears a lot of hats. I'm technically a state agency of one. I have no staff. And my job is part collections manager, part research, part historic preservation, and part educator. I'm also an assistant extension professor at the University of Connecticut, so work with students during the semester as well. But I'm responsible for managing the state's archaeological collections, which are housed here at UConn, and the records of archaeological sites as well, and reports, which are also held at the State Historic Preservation Office. So we have kind of dual responsibility for that. I'm responsible for any human remains of an archaeological context that are found within the state. I sometimes work with the police and the medical examiner when human remains are found and they need archaeological assistance. I work with towns, developers, Native American communities, archaeologists, historical societies, and members of the public to conduct and facilitate archaeological research and historic preservation in different areas. And yeah, I mean, there's never a dull moment. There's always something new. And I learn something new every day. So it's been really fun and really exciting to take this on.
Thank you both so much. And, for the longest time, I had no idea that we had a state librarian and a state archaeologist here in Connecticut. So how and why were these two positions created?
Sure. I can speak to that in terms of state archaeology. The position was initially created back in the 1960s due to concerns about a loss of archaeological resources due to development and infrastructure projects like roads and highways and new housing and things like that. People started to recognize that as all of this stuff was being built, that we were losing a lot of important archaeological sites. Back then, the state archaeologist was just the archaeologist who was on the faculty at UConn at a given time in the anthropology department. And the job largely involved going out and salvaging archaeological materials that were being destroyed basically in real time. It was hard to collect a lot of information and data and really say a lot about that stuff. It was more about just getting it out of the ground and putting it into collections. It also involved managing the Bull collection, which was a massive private collection that was donated to UConn. It's Native American materials from all over Connecticut that were collected, a very long time ago, and oftentimes not under the best of circumstances. Later, as historic preservation laws ramped up and people became more and more aware of, the toll that progress was taking on our cultural and historical resources, the job kind of separated from the anthropology department and teaching a little bit and became its own thing with all of the different topics and aspects that I was talking about before. So, people became more aware that there were more complicated issues involved with archaeology rather than just collecting things and putting them in boxes. It was one, learning to say something about them. What did they mean? What did they tell us about the past? But also the complicated issues of, relationships with Native American people within the state of Connecticut and archaeology, human burials that were being disturbed by development, and also just managing the collections that were being brought in from all of the work that was happening. So then the position became more separate and formalized when Nick Bellantoni got the job back in, I think, 1992.
So the State Library has been in existence since 1854. It actually was originally housed in the old State House, so I thought that was appropriate for today. And it was there with the Supreme Court and other activities. And essentially, from what I understand, the quick answer to that is the Secretary of State's office started collecting more and more books, and they decided that they needed somebody to take care of them and preserve them that were related to the legal operations of the state of Connecticut and what was happening. And so they established the State Library. They established a state librarian, Dr. Trumbull, who was there to take care of it. And since then, it has just continued on. It was actually our third state librarian, George Goddard, who was the one who became really instrumental in shaping what the State Library is today, kind of making a point of looking for what else the State Library could be doing besides just collecting and preserving a specific collection of books, and was actually the person who helped create the building that we're in today. We're across from the Capitol in the State Library and Supreme Court building, so we do share that with another government agency and branch of government. But it was instrumental in kind of the creation of that. And so one of the things that I find interesting is since 1854, there have only been 11 people, and the 11th person to have the state librarian's job. And if you look at the record of people, that clearly many of them stayed for decades. And I think that that's a testament to the work that we do and the interest that there is in this role, and the way that it can be professionally interesting, but also the role that it plays in preserving the state's history. And so it's an honor to be part of what is a very short list of people in the history of the agency.
Okay. Thank you both so much. And speaking of your predecessors, I do believe that both Deborah and Sarah are the first women to have held these positions. How do you feel about being the first woman in your roles, and what do you hope it means for your fields?
I think it's really exciting. It's funny because I have been extremely lucky myself that I've never really felt like my career or my opportunities were limited because I was a woman. I think I was just lucky. I know that that's not the case for everyone who is a colleague or somebody who is growing up today. And certainly in the past, that was not the case. And so for me, it didn't feel quite so momentous, I think, but I also understand that it is a very momentous thing. And I think it means a lot to other people. And I think that that's what I really take seriously, is the chance to demonstrate to other young women that this is an opportunity, that this is something that is available to them, that they can have a position like this. And it doesn't have to be the state librarian or state archaeologist, but there are so many positions in which there have never been women in those positions before. It's just been men. And so I think that there is, I take seriously the chance to show that to other people. I was in the Governor's Summer Reading Challenge a couple of weeks ago, and I was introducing myself to a group of school students. And that was an instance where I thought it was important to point it out because of the audience. I have a friend in New Haven, and I've sort of adopted her children as their auntie. And they were talking in class one day about who famous people that they were related to. And she said, oh, well, we're related to this famous founding father. She's like, but my aunt is the state librarian. And apparently the whole class stopped and Googled me and was learning about things. And I think that that's what's exciting about this type of opportunity, is what it can mean for students today, what it can mean for others in the field to show the opportunities. That, I think, is what's special.
I think much in the way that Deborah was saying, there are a lot of women in archaeology, and there have been for decades. So on the one hand, it doesn't seem like a big deal. New York has a female state archaeologist. Massachusetts and Vermont had them in the 80s. But it's still an important milestone. And it does sometimes bring, being a woman in this position brings different perspectives to the job, I think, and also different challenges. I'm not saying that there is still, I think, a degree of sexism in archaeology, not so much in the field itself, but, we often tend to work with people in archaeology and other kind of more male-dominated fields like engineering and construction and things like that. So, over the last year, there's been several occasions that I've been out in the field and people will just sort of assume that I'm the state archaeologist assistant. And since I don't have a staff, I work with a lot of volunteers, and a lot of them are older, retired people. A lot of them are men. And there's been numerous occasions where someone has just assumed that one of them is the state archaeologist. And then, I have to correct them, and we're all a bit embarrassed. But I do think that it's important to have this role, one, as a role model, for girls, like Deborah was saying, and for boys too, to make them understand, to make it very clear that anybody can do anything, and that we shouldn't be held back by any aspect of our identity if we want to achieve something. But I also think that, you can bring different kind of perspectives to the position, and women bring different perspectives to archaeology than men, and maybe ask different types of questions and think about things in different ways. So I think it's useful for being able to put maybe a new spin on some old stories too, that can be maybe provide us with some new information about the past.
Right. Thank you both so much. So let's start getting into more into the nitty-gritty of your new roles. So how has being a state employee changed the way that you approach your job, if at all?
I would say that it has changed it in some ways for me because, when you work as an academic archaeologist, you pursue research topics and projects that are of interest to you or that are of importance to the field at large. And then working in cultural resources management, which is the kind of professional archaeology that's done prior to development, you basically work on whatever projects fall within the project area, whatever's going to be disturbed by the road or the house or the building. And you don't have a lot of leeway in what you get, you don't get to pick. But now, as a state employee and as a state archaeologist, part of my job is to bring interesting and important Connecticut stories and Connecticut history to the public. So, to raise awareness about our amazing archaeological resources. So I've really taken a very kind of Connecticut focused look at everything now, I think about things through the lens of Connecticut, in terms of Connecticut's landscape, Connecticut's history, Connecticut's people, and how the archaeology relates back to that story, the story of us as a state. So, I think it has changed the way I think about things quite a bit.
I would absolutely agree with that. One of the side effects of moving on a regular basis and living in a lot of different areas and states is you sort of don't put down roots in places. You expect that you're not going to be there that long. You don't really become a member of the community if you're not really aware of what's happening in the state or in your local area. It's probably okay. It's not really impacting the work that you're doing on a daily basis. Whereas as a state employee, as somebody who, as Sarah said, I think about how this is affecting Connecticut residents. I'm thinking specifically about our population. What are the issues within the state of Connecticut? And I'm also conscious of the fact that I'm not originally from Connecticut. So many people that I work with are, but I'm having to play catch up on a lot of those things. The history of Connecticut, the history of the legal community, the history of our cultural heritage sites. All of these things, there's not information it's information I didn't learn in school. I learned other places. And so I sort of set myself on this course of study to catch up on information that other people already have in their pockets. And so that, I think, has been part of it. And it has also been interesting. Sarah may have this kind of the same experience, but as a state employee, because of the fact that I'm the head of an agency, I am an extremely minor public figure now. And so I have to be a little more conscious of the way that, for example, my social media and online presence is. I was never particularly interesting in those kinds of things anyway, but I do need to be careful and thoughtful about how I am portraying myself in that way, because there are more eyes on me than there have been in the past. So I think those are probably the two main ways that it's changed the way I work.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm so glad you both mentioned the hyper focus that you're having on Connecticut history and Connecticut heritage, because that segues beautifully into my next question. Can you expand a little bit on how the work that you're doing right now in your current positions can help bring Connecticut's history to the public in novel and engaging ways?
Yeah, so I think that this is a really good conversation. Sarah talked at the beginning how, we're at the library, we're really about kind of preserving that documentary history. I'm not coming up with the right word, but we are about preserving specific stories. But I think that they have been very specific stories in the past. They were often about only very limited groups of people. And so one of the things that I think that we can do is being sure that we are telling everybody's stories. What is it that was unwritten or was not part of kind of the main focus of what we have been sharing in the past, I think is incredibly important. And I think also the way that the pandemic has impacted things, the way that the development of technology has impacted things means libraries are no longer just a physical space. They're not something that you have to visit in order to use. They are resources, they are services, they're programs that you can access from anywhere. And so we have a much broader scope and audience of people that we can reach. There are people across the country, across the world, who are interested in topics about Connecticut that may not have ever been able to visit or really engage with those in a way that we can now. And so I think that one of the things that we should be very conscious of is thinking about that audience and how we can be connecting with people, how are we using technology, what are we digitizing, what are we choosing to not digitize, and what does that mean for researchers who are interested in the history of Connecticut. So all of those are, I think, ways that we need to be thinking about it. And also just even within the state, not just assuming that people are coming into our physical location, but do we have traveling exhibits? Do we have programs that we can take elsewhere so that we are taking the information to people rather than expecting them to come to us? So all of those, I think, are opportunities for us.
I agree completely. And I think that Deborah touched on a lot of the important things that I would talk about in terms of this as well. One thing that archaeology is great for is it provides a tangible way to put people in touch with the past, because you can literally touch the past when you're doing archaeology. So one thing that the Office of State Archaeology has long done has been involved with offering field schools for students and teachers and veterans and people like that, archaeology days in local communities, and public talks in local communities that can help people get in touch with the history that's all around them. But the pandemic really put a lot of that on hold and made it impossible for us to gather, physically with one another. So it's really, made us think about different ways and the accessibility of this material when maybe we can't be together. So Zoom has been dreadful in many ways in terms of the number of meetings and things like that we've had to have over the last year or so, but it's also been an incredibly powerful tool for bringing archaeology programming to people, not just, and I think that this will extend not just during the pandemic, but beyond, because before people had to drive someplace, and set aside an afternoon to come and do an archaeology event or hear an archaeology talk or something like that. And now that we put them up on Zoom, we're reaching so many more people, and we have the ability to archive them so people can watch them, when it fits into their schedules. But I really do think that, as we get back into reopening, and we have the opportunity to start doing things in person, that really nothing can compete with the hands-on experience of people actually getting to engage in this process. So, over the next couple of years, I hope we can do a lot more public programming on a number of different sites related to different stories in Connecticut's past that will attract different groups of people and help them, really get in touch with the past in a tangible way and appreciate just how much our archaeological resources have to offer.
Thank you both so much. And Deborah, here's a question specifically for you. What do you hope the State Library will achieve in the next couple of years, say 5 years? And also a separate question that I'm sure you're tired of answering, but why are libraries so important?
That is several great questions. So it's interesting that you say 5 years, because one of the things that we're already talking about at the State Library, we're talking about this statewide, and Sarah, I think, is on some meetings about this as well, is the 250th anniversary of our country is in 5 years. And so people are already talking about, how are we going to be celebrating that event? How are we going to be sharing that information? What are the stories that we want to be talking about this time? And so I think that is absolutely something that we're going to be seeing more and more of. And the State Library is privileged to be part of those conversations and part of the events that are happening. So that is definitely something that we're going to be thinking about a lot. One of the things that I think we absolutely need to address, and it's not just Connecticut, it's not just us, is the prevalence of born digital information. So people are creating documents and putting things up online that you historically would have printed in a book, or it would have been a report and would have been added into a physical collection. Now we have email. There is so much about not only our daily lives, but our government, about the operations within the state, which is what we are here to preserve, that are created in formats that we don't have the infrastructure to really preserve in a way that we need to be doing for long-term preservation. And so we are thinking about, how do we do that? What information do we need? How do we create the system and tools that we have? Because unfortunately, it's not as simple as just putting all of your PDFs on a thumb drive or sending them as an email. But there are specific ways in which we preserve that information, in which we record information about the information so that you can find it again. And so we absolutely need to be thinking about how to do that. It's going to change. Certainly, it's going to change a lot of the work that we do, but it's going to be changing the way that many people operate and how they preserve their history in a way that makes it continually accessible to people. So that is absolutely something that we're going to be doing. I think, Mariana, you said earlier that you didn't know there was a state librarian. You're not the first person to say that. And I think that there are a lot of people who don't know about the fact that the state library exists or what it is. And so I think that creating greater understanding and awareness of what we do, becoming a more vocal and more obvious part of the government, a part of the library community is incredibly important. I think we've done really wonderful work on that to date, but I think that there's more that can be done. So that is something I'm thinking about. And in terms of why are libraries important, I think that we've seen just within the last year or so, there have been conversations for many years about why do we need libraries? Why do we need librarians? Everything's online. But I think that what people forget is there is so much information that you still need somebody who can help you find the right information. There are answers that are okay. There are answers that are good enough, but there's the right answer sometimes too. And having somebody who is trained in how to help you do that, how to create it and preserve it in a way that makes it accessible and user-friendly, I think is really important. But also, as we've seen in the past year, libraries are community centers. They're at the heart of their community in many ways. We have so many people in Connecticut, across the country, who don't have regular access to internet, who can't afford the most recent bestseller, or have all kinds of barriers to education and success. There are social issues that we are addressing, and those are being addressed through libraries, and people have remembered that we are these community centers. And I think that has been really important kind of reminder for people. And so there's more to libraries than books. Libraries, like I said, are people. They're connecting you with your community, their services. And I think that what we'll find is libraries may not always look the way that they do now or what they looked like a couple of decades ago, but I think that libraries will always be here. It's the question of what is it going to look like? And I think that the important thing is that we're thinking about that. We're thinking about what is the future of a library and how are we going to continue to be part of our communities.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah. That's so true. Over here at the Old State House, whenever we're doing research, we depend fully on librarians to help us find anything that we need.
We're happy to do it, so keep on.
Thank you so much. You're lifesavers. Librarians are lifesavers. And Sarah, here's a question for you. What is being done to protect archaeological sites here in Connecticut? And what kind of archaeological material exists in Connecticut?
Yeah, I'm going to start with the second part of your question, because I think that, a lot of people are often surprised. We don't necessarily think of archaeology as something right here in our backyards. We think of it as something exotic. Archaeology is in Egypt, archaeology is in Greece, archaeology is in South America. But the archaeology of Connecticut spans 12,500 years or possibly more of human occupation. And we have archaeological resources, reflecting the first human presence here in Connecticut from the end of the last ice age, when the glaciers finally retreated and the land was able to support plant and animal and then human life up to the present day. So that's a massive record of human lives, human stories, and human use of the landscape. And our archaeological record includes materials left behind by the indigenous people who lived here for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, as well as sites from the contact period, which is the time period where Europeans' goods and diseases and then European colonists started coming into Connecticut, into what is now Connecticut, I should say, and, causing massive amounts of cultural change, cultural upheaval, but also, really complicated entanglements and interactions between colonists and native people. We have that reflected in our archaeological record. We also have archaeological materials from the colonial period. We have all kinds of battlefield sites related to the Pequot War, King Philip's War, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, going all the way up through. And then, it also has archaeological materials reflecting the more recent history of agricultural Connecticut and industrialization in Connecticut and immigration to Connecticut, and then, modern Connecticut in the 20th century. So the record is incredibly rich and, incredibly worthy of preservation and of exposure to the public and being used as a tool to tell all those fascinating stories. In terms of protecting the archaeological resources of Connecticut, there are laws at the state and federal level that have been put into place to protect archaeological resources from development primarily. So these regulations are usually triggered if a project has state or federal permitting or funding, and then it would require archaeological surveys to see if materials are going to be affected, and then possibly mitigation if things can't be avoided. Many towns in Connecticut also have their own municipal regulations around development, requiring archaeological review, so to catch these sites before they might be just destroyed. But another important aspect of preservation is public knowledge and public interest. The more people know and care about the historical and archaeological resources in their community, the more likely they are to value them and fight for preservation. So that's another important aspect of it as well, is sort of the grassroots desire to preserve, buildings and sites and things like that that are of local importance.
Thank you both so much. And Sarah, this is a question that I just thought of right now. Whenever someone's planning to develop an area, is it necessary for archaeologists to do some sort of survey before they even start the construction, or only if they find something during the project?
No, oftentimes it's required beforehand, and that it has to do with a lot of where the funding for the project is coming from and what kind of permits are involved. But many projects, particularly large-scale projects, require archaeological review and archaeological survey. So a lot of that is done through the State Historic Preservation Office. They're the ones that review project areas and decide if a survey needs to be conducted, for the most part in Connecticut.
All right, thank you. And here's a fun question. How do you believe that archaeology and libraries can complement each other in your work?
I think that's a really great question. We talked a little bit about this before, about libraries are the repository for all kinds of important information. And that information from the archaeological perspective is crucial to contextualizing what we find in the archaeological record. So I'm talking about things like primary documents, historical texts, ethnographic texts, things that provide a little bit more background information about the period that we're studying or the people that we're interested in. And then archaeology, in turn, fills in the gaps in those records by giving us the intimate details of people's day-to-day lives, what they wore, what they ate, what their houses looked like, things like that. So I think that together, that combined body of information can tell really rich stories about the past, much richer than either can alone. But libraries are also important places for bringing archaeology to the public, I think. They're often important places in local communities. They often host things like lectures and exhibits, and, sometimes artifact days and things like that. So that's a great location, too, for bringing people, bringing archaeology into communities.
I think that that's absolutely right. I hadn't quite thought about that connection before, but I think that this really is a really wonderful partnership to share that information. As Sarah was saying, we create the records of what happened. We collect information about all kinds of different things, industry, all kinds of things that are happening. And we often don't quite know the impact of what we're collecting. In some cases, you have a material or a book that you don't realize until later shares information or a story that people were not aware of. And so I think that, as Sarah said, and it being a site for bringing the community together to share that information, I think is something that is incredibly important. I don't know if Sarah remembers this. I think we're about the same age, but when I was in, I think, middle school, there was a series of books that was put out by Scholastic that you could get through the Book of the Month Club, and it was all about different archaeological digs across the world. And there was one about raising the Titanic, or about looking into the Titanic and the Bismarck and Vesuvius. And it was just this fascinating look at all of these various archaeological digs and what was happening and what they learned. And it was also about creating and connecting the stories of the people who were impacted by it, looking at the documentary record of those events and what led to it and what has happened since then. I still have those books because I just remember how amazing it was to be able to see that in a context and information that I had no idea about, in particularly because of those different types of digs and the work that was being done. And so I think that the partnership is a really fantastic one to kind of join together to create a whole picture to what happened in our past.
Right. Thank you both so much. And we just got a comment on Facebook about this, actually. Laura Smith says, you can find the archaeological surveys that Sarah was talking about earlier at the Yukon Archives. So that's another way that archaeology and libraries always are connected. Let's see, we're running a little short on time, and I still have a lot of questions for you. Let me see which one. What projects are you both most excited about?
I think one of them, I'm definitely very excited about the America 250 conversations. I think because certainly within the state library, we are talking about, as I've said kind of before, what are the stories that we want to tell? What are the people that we maybe weren't included in the last celebration? And how are we going to be doing that? I think that is something that's going to be really exciting. And one of the things that I found really wonderful about Connecticut is there is this rich interest and awareness of the need for partnership, that we're not just the State Archaeologist's office, the state library, the various museums that are working separately. There is a wonderful interest in partnering with each other, and how can we merge our interests and merge our collections in a way that helps us create and share that complete story or record of what has happened. And so I think that is very much something that I'm excited about seeing coming down the road. I think that we have some other opportunities for this is my first chance to work with a museum. And so I think that we have some really wonderful opportunities for how we are going to be doing that, and partnerships. I know I've been in conversations with the Old State House about ways that we can continue to do some partnerships for programming and exhibits moving forward. So those are a couple of the things that I am excited about for right now.
So I'm going to talk about two projects that are they're sort of long-term research projects that the Office of State Archaeology is involved in. And I think they both have the potential to tell really interesting and really important stories about different aspects of Connecticut's history that have kind of been understudied to this point. So the first one is the Hollister Farm site in Glastonbury, where the late state archaeologist Brian Jones had started a research program several years ago, and I've taken it on. This is a mid-17th century farm complex on what would have been the outskirts of Connecticut Colony in the 17th century. The land was owned by John Hollister, who lived in Wethersfield, and it was first farmed by a tenant family, the Gilberts, and then after 1665 by Hollister's son, John Jr. The site is in a field. It's been completely untouched for hundreds of years. The preservation is astounding, and we're just learning so much about what life was like in the early days of English settlement in Connecticut Colony in terms of foodways and economic activities, architecture, the really complicated interactions that the colonists and indigenous people were engaged in at that time, and just everything. So we've been doing digs out there for several years with volunteers and teachers and students, and it's offered a really great way to bring that history to a wide range of people in the state, and also learn about something that we don't really know a lot about. The other project I'm really excited about is a new one that we started this year at the Peters House site in Hebron. This was a house that was purchased by a free African-American family in 1806. The Peters family is well known in Hebron for this incredible story. They were rescued from sale, basically, as captives to South Carolina by their white neighbors after the man who owned them, who was a Tory, left Connecticut right before the Revolutionary War and basically forfeited all of his property. But, and that story is one about the Peters family being saved and being, valued members of the community of Hebron. But it doesn't tell us much about the family themselves. And, they really were leaders in the local African-American community. They saved enough money to buy a house near the center of town. Their children went to school with all the other children in Hebron. And, they lived rich, full lives about which we know almost nothing. So the project, which is being carried out with input from the Peters family descendants and local historians in Hebron, really aims to flesh out their story by learning things about their daily lives and telling the story of them as people, as individuals, rather than just as a family that was kind of rescued and saved. So I'm really excited about kind of putting a new spin on that story and talking about learning more about that and sharing it with everyone.
Right. Thank you both. And here's another question. What technologies have particularly changed the way that you work and preserve the past in your fields?
I can start, I guess. So important technologies in archaeology recently have been GIS, geographic information systems, and ground penetrating radar are the two that I would talk about right now. Geographic information systems are really crucial because for years and years, everything had to be done with paper files, paper maps, everything. Now it's possible to create and update maps and link them to other types of information showing where archaeological resources and archaeologically sensitive areas are. And, a lot of communities are developing their own sensitivity assessments that they have in their planning and zoning departments, so they can kind of get a handle on when sites might be threatened. They're also used in my office and in the State Historic Preservation Office to better manage the data of where these archaeological sites are and what areas are sensitive. And ground penetrating radar is another really important one. It's, a tool that's been used recently in archaeology as kind of a non-invasive survey technique in some types of sites. So I was talking about this Hollister site. It's in the river valley. It's got very nice sandy soils. GPR doesn't work as well where there's lots of rocks, but they were actually able to go over this site with ground penetrating radar and find these buried cellar holes, buried well, and all of these other features that really enabled a more efficient way to start the archaeological work instead of just digging a bunch of holes and hoping that you would find something. So that's been really important as well. And another one, I guess I would say, would be metal detectors. Archaeologists have a long, fraught relationship with metal detectorists because we tend to think of it as people looting and ruining archaeological sites. But mostly through the work of Dr. Kevin McBride, who's been working on the Pequot War battlefield project for the last decade or so, the realization that metal detectors and skilled metal detectorists are a hugely important tool for helping to identify and define historic period sites with a lot of metal artifacts. And again, helping to more efficiently locate and define these resources, which saves time and money and allows us to get at the more dense areas of information more quickly, which is really, really important and really useful.
And I would say, I was thinking about this question as well, and I think that there are absolutely things like the scanners that we use to digitize information, the way that we preserve it and keep the records, the fact that we have cloud storage for many things, and the cost of technology has gone down and it's allowed us to do more. But I think the thing that has really impacted library work in this area is actually just the fact that technology is so prevalent for everyday person. The access and use of it is just so easy. Everybody can become a content creator. It used to be that in order to become a published author, you had to go through a very particular route, and only a limited number of books were selected for publication. It took a long time, and they would go out of print, and then you couldn't find access to them. And now everybody can become an author. Everybody can put information up online. And then also just the ease with which we can create electronic materials, the emails that we create, the documents that we create, all of our videos and tweets, and everything that we can do with it has become an explosion of information. And so trying to preserve that as a library, as somebody who is thinking about how to keep records of that, is absolutely impacting what we're doing. And so I think that it's not just some specific technologies, but just the prevalence, the ease of use, the cost of technology that has changed the way that we do our work in ways that are just beyond just one particular tool.
All right, thank you both so much. Yeah, I feel like we've entered an era where technology is just changing everything so fast. Like, it opens up a lot of venues and it opens up the world pretty much for all of us. But at the same time, it's becoming a little bit harder to keep up with it.
Yes.
But, especially this last year, we have been completely dependent on technology to do our jobs. Here's a bit of a longer question. There have been a lot of debate recently about how we record, interpret, and disseminate history and the lost or hidden stories of people of color and other historically disadvantaged groups. How do you address these topics in your current position? And has the dialogue surrounding these topics over the last few years changed anything about the way you do your job?
I think that is a really important question. We have definitely been thinking about that. It impacts us in a number of different ways. So one of them is the terminology that we use. So for example, you're used to being able to type search words into a catalog record or into a database in order to find information. And the way that those records were, the index terms, the terminology that we used reflected the times in many cases. And so the terms that maybe were used in the past are terms that we would find offensive or inappropriate now. And so we need to be thinking about how do we update the terminology that we use so that we are mindful of those things. But you also have to acknowledge that that is how the terminology was used in the past. And so how do you still help people find those materials while you're doing that? And so you might have to not only change the terminology, or you might have to say the research that you're doing is related to terminology that somebody might find offensive or inaccurate. And you need to be aware of that as you are doing your research. But you can't just erase that terminology, because then you're erasing the history of the fact that that happened and was an event and needed to be discussed as a culture. And so you have to tread the line between providing information and trying to make people aware of the issues, while also acknowledging the fact that we have had those things happen in the past and what we have learned from them. So that's one way that it's impacting what we're doing. It's impacting other things that we're working on. So for example, we have put together several grant applications that are helping us to look specifically into cultures, minority cultures who had maybe not been the focus of research in the past. And there is a lot of interest in this because there has been a lot of interest in this nationwide in the world about these issues. And so there is a lot of money available for these things. And so we want to take advantage of it because we want to be able to do that research and provide that information for people. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that, for example, this is not my culture. And so I can't just assume that I know what I'm talking about in that area. I need to be listening to the cultures that we're talking about. We need to have their input on how we do those things, if they are interested in us doing those things, and how can we be working together. And we don't want to be seen as people who are doing these projects simply because, well, we got money for it, because that shouldn't be our motivation. And so treading the line on those questions as well, I think, is something that is interesting. And then just staff training, staff understanding of these issues, and the conversations that need to be happening internally as well as externally, so that we can be comfortable talking about these things and the role that they have played, the impact that these decisions have had on our history, I think, is really important. I gave some testimony to the legislature a couple of months ago that was talking about race-related restrictive covenants. And again, it was an example of, well, let's just take those pages out of the books and destroy them. But you can't do that, because then you're destroying the fact that that was something that happened in our history, and we need to talk about that too. So how do you create a way to mitigate the damage of it while acknowledging the fact that it happened and how we learned from it? So absolutely, these are all things that are happening within the library community and that we need to be very thoughtful and mindful of.
Yeah. I would echo a lot of what Deborah said, but from a more archaeological perspective. So first of all, traditionally archaeology in Connecticut focused on two things mostly. One was telling the stories of Native American life prior to the arrival of Europeans through the archaeology, and generally without any input from the descendants of those people. It was us telling them and telling everybody else, how people lived and what happened and that type of thing. The other focus was generally high status colonial period sites that kind of, showcased a history of, Connecticut's architecture and important historical figures and events and things like that. But, a lot of that has changed. We've really come as a field, I think, to the realization that it's not appropriate for us to tell people what their past was like, what their ancestors were like, what their stories were. And archaeologists across the board, I think, and here in Connecticut as well, are starting to work to integrate other voices into the telling of those stories and integrate descendant communities into the work, and to not do archaeological research without the permission and involvement of descendant communities in many cases. And, here in Connecticut, many of the Native American tribes have started their own archaeology programs, and they're working to tell their own stories. So that's been, really important for us to realize that it's no longer our job as scientists, as experts, to tell everybody how it was. It's got to be a more multivocal experience of talking about and investigating the past. The other thing I think is just, broadening the range of the types of research that we do and the types of stories that we tell. So, I've been really interested over the last few years in looking at some kinds of projects, one involving inmates at Newgate Prison and the types of food that they were eating and the living conditions and things like that, as reflected from the archaeology and the documentary record. Working, at the Peters House site, as I spoke about, to learn about the daily lives of free African-American people in 19th century Connecticut. And we're also working and offering the resources of the Office of State Archaeology, our archaeological expertise, our volunteers, to help different groups of people get archaeology done if they don't necessarily have the resources to pay for it and things like that. So we've been working on a project with the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center in Bridgeport to do some archaeology at the Freeman houses. These are houses they're the last standing structures from a prosperous 19th century free Black community that existed in Bridgeport, and they're being renovated right now. And there's a huge community effort there to turn this into an important cultural center, and offering the resources to help them get some of the archaeology done and integrate that information into, those sites when they become open to the public. So I think that there's a lot of overlap in the types of things we're doing, but a lot of it just involves, more inclusive voices, and recognizing the things that we've done wrong in the past and maybe trying to fix those as we move forward.
Right. Thank you both so much. These are such important conversations to be having in all of our fields. So now we're running a little bit over time, but we do have a couple of questions from the audience that I do want to get to. So Marvin from Facebook is asking, is there still a bookstore at the library? In the 70s, I would visit and buy books at the bookstore.
We don't currently have a bookstore, but you're thinking along the same lines that I am, and I would love to see us have a little shop in the future. So stay posted. But unfortunately for right now, we don't have a bookshop.
Thank you. And Linda, also from Facebook, is asking, are there any historic cookbooks in the State Library?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. I think that's a fantastic question, and I don't know, but I need to look into it. I know that there are a couple of recent episodes of the Grating the Nutmeg podcast that talks about Connecticut cookery, and I would encourage you to take a look at those. There are some recent books that are on that topic, but I need to take a look and see if we have them. That is a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. And Susan has a longer question. Susan says, as an anthropologist with a lifelong interest in hyperlocal history of Western Connecticut, and now researching it almost full-time in retirement, I deeply appreciate what both of you do. Do you have plans to do lots of outreach throughout Connecticut's individual towns by online or in person when possible, to make folks really aware of the resources and importance of preserving history, whether it is documents or sites?
I mean, that's actually a really good question because, traditionally, we reach out and, give talks and do program and things like that if people kind of come to us and ask for it. But I really like the idea of kind of taking the initiative and getting out there. The downside of that, I think, is that that's an awful lot of territory to cover with with very little staff. But it might be, possible to do regional topics or presentations, especially now that we can open things up more in terms of Zoom and other online avenues that would let more people, see those things.
I think I would say the same thing. We tend to do the presentations because somebody has reached out to us and asked them, but we absolutely have a lot of very hyper-local information about towns. There are survey maps. There are all kinds of things that we have. We have probate records. We have other court records, newspapers from different locations. And I like the idea of being proactive and thinking about that. So that's a good one to think about. So thank you.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we have right now, unless I'm missing one, maybe from YouTube. Let me see. No, I think think that's it. All right. Well, thank you both so much. This was so wonderful. Thank you for a great program. Would you like to have any closing thoughts? Do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap things up?
I would just say thank you to everybody for joining us today. I think this has been a really wonderful conversation. Thank you to Mariana for putting it together and the really wonderful the questions that we had. And I would say I would just encourage you to check out the State Library, think about what we have, and reach out to us, because I think that this has been hopefully just the start of a conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say, thank you very much for everybody who tuned in today. And for your interest. And for those of you who might be interested in getting more involved with the archaeology of Connecticut, there are a couple of really great organizations that you can get involved with. One is the Archaeological Society of Connecticut, which hosts annual meetings and has a journal every year with different articles about the archaeology of Connecticut. The other is the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, which is the nonprofit group that supports my office in terms of volunteers for archaeological projects and educational outreach activities and things like that. So if you're interested, both of those are great ways to get more involved in archaeology.
And I'm going to add one thing, that Sarah and I are both involved in a project that's called Digging into History. It's something that's sponsored by the State Library. And a couple of years ago, it took students from Connecticut over to France to do a dig there on a World War I site. And we're hoping to do something similar, bring French students here next summer to work on a Connecticut site. So if you're a high school age student or know somebody who is high school age and is interested in that kind of thing, we're going to be opening that up for applications. So we hope you'll keep an eye out for that.
Great, thank you. That all sounds like super cool programs. Thank you so much. So before we log off, I would just like to take a quick minute to let everybody know about some upcoming programs here at Connecticut's Old State House. On Tuesday, June the 22nd at noon, we have our next conversation at noon, Historic Preservation and Diversity. We have a very large panel with lots of people to talk about how they're preserving Connecticut and making sure we tell the most diverse stories that we can. And also, I would like to let everybody know that we have started our farmers market, our summer farmers market, which are open every Tuesdays and Fridays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So if you'd like to get some fresh produce and fresh veggies here in downtown Hartford, come check us out. And also our summer concert series will be starting this Friday with Mass Confusion. This event will be at noon as well. And it will also be streamed on our Facebook and YouTube pages if you can't make it in person. So that is all. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Deborah and Sarah, again, for a really good conversation. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.